All right, ready to dive deep into the philosophy of mind. Today we're taking on a concept that really shakes things up, externalism.
Ooh, yeah, externalism.
It challenges that traditional idea, that our minds are neatly contained within our heads, and suggests that the world outside actually plays a much bigger role than we might think.
Way bigger, way bigger.
Our guide for this journey,
Let's hear it.
the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on, get this, externalism about the mind.
Classic.
Get ready to have your mind blown wide open because we're going to discover how things outside of you, like language or even a simple notebook, might actually be part of your mind.
That's right. Externalism really makes us rethink that whole traditional view of the mind. That it's completely internal. It suggests that our environment isn't just some backdrop, but like an active player in shaping our thoughts or beliefs.
So instead of our minds being like isolated islands, they're more like interconnected ecosystems.
Exactly. To really get a grip on externalism, we've got to unpack its two main branches: content externalism and vehicle externalism,
Two branches, got it.
often called the extended mind.
Okay, two branches. Two ways our minds might reach beyond our skulls. Let's start with content externalism. What's the core idea there?
Content externalism argues that what our thoughts are about their content is influenced by things outside of us. It's not just about what's happening in our brains, but how our environment shapes the very meaning of our thoughts.
So it's saying that the world outside us isn't just something we perceive, it's actively involved in constructing the meaning of our thoughts.
You got it. A classic example is Putnam's twin Earth thought experiment. Imagine a planet identical to Earth, except the liquid they call water. It has a different chemical composition, even though it looks and behaves exactly like our water.
Okay, got it. Two Earths, two kinds of water. But where does the mind come in?
Well, picture this. You and your twin on twin Earth both point at a glass of this water and say, "Water is wet." Would you be having the same thought? Putnam argues no, because the meaning of water is determined by the actual substance you're referring to in your respective environments.
Ah, I see. Even though the word is the same, the underlying reality it's connected to is different, which changes the content of the thought. So our thoughts about the world are kind of intertwined with the world itself.
Exactly. It's like our thoughts are anchored to the actual stuff out there, not just to some internal dictionary in our minds.
This is making me think about how we learn new things. Like, my understanding of democracy has definitely evolved over time as I've encountered different political systems and events, is that content externalism in action.
That's a great example. The content of your thought about democracy has been shaped by your real-world experiences and the different ways that concept is manifested in different societies.
So it's not just about passively receiving information. It's about how our thoughts are constantly being molded by our interactions with the world.
Now, another thought experiment that gets into content externalism is Burge's arthritis example. Imagine someone who mistakenly believes they have arthritis in their thigh, even though, arthritis only affects joints.
Wait, so their belief is objectively false?
Right. But the interesting part is that the content of their belief, it's still influenced by the meaning of arthritis in their community. Even though their belief is incorrect, it's still shaped by the shared understanding of that term in their social world.
It's like how the language we use, which is something external to us, can actually shape the content of our beliefs, even when those beliefs are mistaken.
Now, content externalism has its critics, of course. Some argue that these thought experiments, they rely too heavily on intuition, and others propose the idea of narrow content.
Narrow content, what's that about?
The idea is that there might be a part of our thoughts that's insulated from those external influences, a kind of core meaning that's independent of the environment. It's a complex debate, but it highlights that content externalism isn't without its challenges.
Right. It's important to acknowledge there are different perspectives on this.
Yeah.
But before we get too deep into those debates, let's shift gears and explore the second branch of externalism,
Ooh, yes, let's do it.
vehicle externalism,
All right.
also known as the extended mind thesis.
The extended mind. Here we go.
This one takes things a step further.
Oh, yeah.
Proposes that some of the physical stuff of our minds might actually exist outside of our brains. Whoa, hold on. You're saying parts of my mind could be out there, in the world.
It's a pretty radical idea.
That's where my brain starts to melt a little.
For sure. Think about Clark and Chalmers' thought experiment about Otto, who has Alzheimer's. He relies on a notebook to store and access information, much like memory in a healthy person.
So the notebook is like an external hard drive for his brain.
Exactly. And here's where things get interesting. Clark and Chalmers argue that if the notebook functions just like a belief, allowing Otto to access information, guide his actions, and so on, then maybe it is a belief.
So they're suggesting the notebook is literally part of his mind, extending his cognitive abilities beyond his brain.
Yes. Challenging that traditional boundary of the mind, saying it's not limited to what's going on inside our skulls.
Okay, that's wild. Makes you wonder if all the tools we use, smartphones, calendars, even Google searches, are those part of our extended minds too? Are we all cyborgs without realizing it?
That's a great question, and one that has sparked a lot of debate. One objection is the worry about cognitive bloat. Would accepting this view mean everything becomes part of our minds? Where do we draw the line?
Right. My coffee cup might be handy, but it doesn't feel like part of my mind.
To address this, some philosophers have shifted the focus from static objects to dynamic processes. They argue it's not just about the notebook itself, but the active process of using it, scribbling notes, searching for information, integrating that information into our actions. That becomes part of our thinking.
So it's not that the notebook magically becomes part of my brain,
Mhm.
but rather that the process of engaging with it, the back and forth, the scribbling, the searching, becomes part of a larger cognitive process that extends beyond the brain.
Precisely. Our minds extend into the world through our interactions with it. And this isn't just about notebooks and smartphones. Think about how we use language to communicate, how we collaborate with others to solve problems, how we rely on cultural artifacts and institutions to shape our understanding of the world.
Wow, it's like our minds are constantly reaching out, weaving themselves into the fabric of the world around us. But if parts of our minds can exist outside our brains, what does that mean for how we understand ourselves and our relationship to the world?
That is a question with some pretty huge implications, and one we will keep exploring in the next part of our deep dive. So, picking up where we left off, this idea of the extended mind, it really challenges those traditional boundaries between self and world. It raises some pretty big questions about what it even means for something to be part of a cognitive system.
It makes you wonder, where does the mind end and the world begin? Is there even like a clear distinction?
That's the big question, right? It leads us to this concept of the mark of the cognitive, the
Yeah.
quest to define, what makes a process truly cognitive in the first place.
Right.
Because if we're saying, okay, our minds can extend into the world, well, we need some way to tell the difference between what counts as part of that extended system and what doesn't.
Otherwise, we're stuck with that cognitive bloat problem.
Right.
My coffee cup, my socks, even the weather, they can't all be part of my mind.
Exactly. Now, there are different views on this. Some philosophers think we don't need like a rigid mark of the cognitive. They say, just like biology studies life without a strict definition of life, cognitive science can study the mind without a hard and fast definition of cognition.
That's an interesting thought. But doesn't it make things a bit fuzzy?
hmm
How can we even talk about the extended mind if we can't even pinpoint what makes something a mind in the first place?
Yeah, that's a valid concern. Other philosophers say, no, 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 we absolutely do need a mark of the cognitive.
Right.
And they've proposed, various criteria. And some of these criteria, if they're right, they would actually rule against the extended mind thesis.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so they'd say, look, this notebook might be useful for Otto, but it doesn't meet the criteria to be considered part of his cognitive system.
So they'd say, look, this notebook might be useful for Otto, but it doesn't meet the criteria to be considered part of his cognitive system.
Right. They might say, for example, the notebook lacks certain features of cognition, like original intentionality. This idea that thoughts have inherent aboutness that isn't derived from something else.
Okay.
They argue that the notebook's aboutness is derived from Otto's mind, not his own.
But couldn't you argue that even our internal mental states are kind of built upon simpler processes that lack original intentionality? Like maybe our beliefs are ultimately grounded in non-intentional brain states?
That's a great point. And some proponents of the extended mind, they would argue exactly that. They say, hey, the criteria for cognition shouldn't be so strict as to exclude external elements that play, a really big role in our thinking. They might say the focus should be on things like the functional role of a process, how well it's integrated into our overall cognitive system, and whether it helps us achieve our goals.
So if Otto's notebook reliably stores and retrieves information, guiding his actions effectively, it could pass the test and be considered a genuine part of his mind, even if it doesn't have original intentionality.
Exactly. But this debate is far from settled. And it gets even more complex when we consider the social dimension of the extended mind.
Oh yeah, we touched on that earlier, how our interactions with others and our engagement with cultural systems could also shape and extend our minds. It's like our minds aren't just reaching out into the world, they're reaching out to each other?
That's right. And this social turn in extended mind research, it's opened up a whole bunch of new questions. For example, some researchers are looking at how couples or groups, how they can develop shared cognitive systems, almost like a collective extended mind.
So, like how my partner and I seem to have a joint memory system. I remember the details of our finances, they remember everyone's birthdays. We're a perfect cognitive team.
That's a great everyday example. It suggests that the boundaries of individual minds can become really blurry in social contexts. And it raises these fascinating questions about the nature of memory, collaboration, and even collective intelligence.
And what about the role of language? I mean, we use language to communicate, to learn, even to think to ourselves. Could language itself be seen as kind of external scaffolding for our thoughts? Like a shared cognitive resource that extends our minds?
For sure, language provides us with these concepts, categories, and ways of structuring information that profoundly shape our thinking. Think about how different languages have different ways of expressing time, or different categories for classifying objects. It makes you wonder if speaking different languages could actually lead to different kinds of extended minds.
It's almost as if the language we speak is like a tool that shapes the very architecture of our thinking.
Exactly. It highlights this idea that our cognitive systems aren't fixed, but constantly evolving. And a lot of that evolution is happening through our interactions with the world, including those social and cultural landscapes we inhabit. This leads us to a broader framework known as 4E cognition.
For cognition, what are we talking about here? Some kind of super-powered mental upgrade.
Uh-huh. No, not quite. But it is about expanding our understanding of the mind. 4E, it stands for embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended cognition. These are all these interconnected ideas that challenge that traditional view of the mind as a disembodied, isolated information processor.
Okay, so we've covered extended, but what about the other E's?
Let's start with embodied. This emphasizes that our minds are not separate from our bodies. Our physical experiences, our movements, even our senses, they all shape our thinking in these fundamental ways.
So it's not just about having a brain in a vat. It's about how our brains, bodies, and experiences all work together to make sense of the world.
Exactly. Think about how your senses provide you with information, how emotions influence your decisions, or how even your posture can affect your mood and your thinking.
Wow, I never really considered how much my physical state could be influencing my thoughts and perceptions. It's like our minds and bodies are constantly in this dialogue.
Now, embedded cognition kind of builds on that idea. It highlights how our cognitive processes are shaped by the physical and social contexts in which they occur.
So, like how using a map changes the way we navigate, or how working in a team changes the way we solve problems.
Precisely. Our minds are constantly interacting with the world around us, and those interactions really shape the way we think. It's not just about what's going on inside our heads, but about how we're situated in the world.
And what about enacted cognition? That one still sounds a bit mysterious to me.
Enacted cognition, it focuses on that dynamic, interactive nature of our thinking. It emphasizes that we learn and make sense of the world through action.
So it's not just about passively receiving information, but about actively engaging with the world, experimenting, and making adjustments based on our experiences.
Exactly. Think about learning a new skill, like playing a musical instrument or learning a new language. It's not just about memorizing facts, it's about actively engaging in the practice, making mistakes, and refining your approach based on feedback.
So it's like our minds are not pre-programmed machines, but constantly evolving systems that learn and adapt through action.
And here's the key point. These 4 E's, they're not mutually exclusive. They can overlap and interact in these complex ways. The extended mind, for instance, it can also be embodied, embedded, and enacted.
So it's not just about our minds reaching out into the world, but about how our bodies, our environment, and our actions all play a part in shaping our cognitive processes.
Precisely. And that's why it's so important to consider all these perspectives when we're trying to understand the full richness and complexity of human cognition.
It seems like we've only just begun to scratch the surface of how these different aspects of cognition interact and shape our understanding of the world.
hmm
But where do we go from here?
Yeah, it's mind-blowing to think those traditional boundaries of the mind might be way more fluid than we once thought.
It really is.
But our minds are constantly spilling out into the world,
hmm
and being shaped by it in return.
Absolutely.
Speaking of the world around us, it seems like technology plays a pretty big role in this whole extended mind idea. I mean, we're surrounded by devices and tools that help us think and remember and communicate.
Totally. Technology is a huge part of that extended mind conversation. We see it with things like smartphones, wearable tech, even the internet itself. They're becoming extensions of our cognitive abilities.
It's like they're becoming extra limbs for our minds, helping us reach further and do more than we ever could on our own.
But this also raises some questions, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like, what happens when we become so reliant on these external tools?
Right. You're spot on. There are definitely ethical things to think about when we're thinking about the extended mind and technology. For example, as our cognitive abilities become more and more intertwined with all this technology out there, questions of access and control become really important.
So if our minds are kind of extending into these devices, who has access to them? Who controls the information?
Exactly.
What happens when that technology breaks down or becomes outdated?
Those are all really important concerns. If our thinking is becoming more reliant on these systems, then things like digital equity, data privacy, and the potential for bias in technology, those become super important.
It's almost like we're outsourcing parts of our minds to these technologies. And that brings up some big questions about like responsibility, autonomy, what it even means to be human in a world where technology is such a huge part of things.
Exactly. It really emphasizes the need for us to be thoughtful and aware of the ethical side of things as we develop and integrate these powerful technologies into our lives. But, on a more positive note, the extended mind idea can help us appreciate the power of social interaction and collaboration.
We talked about that earlier, the idea that our minds can actually connect with others
Yeah,
to form shared cognitive systems, like a collective extended mind.
right.
It makes you realize just how much we depend on each other for learning and problem solving,
Yeah,
even just understanding the world.
for sure. Think about how we brainstorm ideas in a group, how we learn from each other just through talking, how we build knowledge together through different cultural things. These are all great examples of our minds kind of extending beyond our individual boundaries to connect with other people,
Right.
to create something even bigger than ourselves.
It's like we're all little nodes in a massive interconnected network of minds,
Yeah.
just constantly sharing information and ideas and, different perspectives.
It's beautiful, isn't it? And recognizing this interconnectedness can have a big impact on how we think about things like education, social justice, and even our own personal growth. It highlights the importance of diversity and the power of working together.
This is really making me rethink how I see myself and my place in the world. It's not just about what's happening inside my head, but about how I'm connected to other people, to my environment, to the things I use.
It's a pretty powerful shift in perspective, and it really highlights that our minds aren't static. There are these dynamic processes that are always being shaped by our interactions with the world.
So what's the takeaway for everyone listening?
hmm
If our minds are really extended, embodied, embedded, and enacted, what does that mean for how we should live our lives?
It encourages us to be aware of how we interact with the world around us. It reminds us that our thoughts and our actions aren't these isolated things. They're part of this larger interconnected web. It invites us to be curious, to be open-minded, and to be willing to engage with different points of view.
It's a call to embrace how fluid our minds are and to see ourselves as actively shaping not only our own understanding, but also the understanding of our communities and the whole world.
Beautiful. And with that, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the extended mind, a concept that's always pushing those boundaries of what it means to be human.
It's definitely something to think about. Keep those minds extending, keep asking questions, and we'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.